Welcome to the VO2 Lounge. In this episode, we're going to talk about super shoes, but more specifically, how they seem to benefit women more than they benefit men. This is potentially the first or second. I don't know where this is going to land in my output schedule. But with, as you can see if you're on Spotify, video. Spotify recently, I think, have started pushing video content. I noticed sort of a lull in the amount of new people finding the show. Did a little bit of Reddit diving and discovered this whole malarkey. So, going forward, to keep the growth of the pod going, we're going to have Spotify exclusive. I think Spotify exclusive. I don't think Apple Podcasts has this yet, but it's going to be Spotify video. So let me know what you think. Right. So most people listening to this have probably experienced the effects of super shoes. But if not, let me tell you about my first experience. That's with the New Balance Fuel Cell RC Elite. I think it's Gen 1. Not that clued up on exactly their releases since the ones I purchased, but I'm not much of a runner myself. But the work sort of semi-private health scheme is associated with a place called Runner's Need, or at least has a benefit with them where you get 50% off a pair of trainers every year. Now, it used to be that you could get the discount on top of any existing discount. So these shoes were down from £210 to, let me think, 140, and then on top of that, got the discount of 50%. So we're talking like £70 super shoes. Worth it just for a punt and to see whether I actually it could convince me to maintain running, which it did up until I started cycling again. So yeah, that's how it is. But my experience from them, I mainly use them in intervals, and occasionally just trying to mess around and set like a PR over a distance. That's important because really where you'll notice these benefits are in that like sub 4 minute region, the high threes, low threes. They've been designed for elites running marathons and halves in like the sort of sub 3 minute realm. So that's where you notice the difference the most, and it definitely makes you feel fast. You can feel the kind of the energy return. You can almost feel like your stride lengths being increased in a way. It's a bit of a weird feeling, but they're a bit wobbly, definitely, to begin with. They do feel a bit different on the strike. When you're just walking around, they feel really strange, and you can feel that carbon plate almost trying to force you to do this kind of like arch roll through movement. And yeah, but overall, super comfy shoes, really, in my opinion. The padding just seems to, I don't know, to me, the discomfort comes in a bit of a different way. I feel like my calves almost get a bit more of a pounding, but yeah, if you haven't tried them already, just know that they just make you feel just like you're really opening up and you're really running fast. Now, specifically, my reason for this episode is after listening to the Real Science of Sport podcast episode where they discuss Chepngetich's marathon world record of 2 hours, 9 minutes, 58 seconds. This is, if you're out of the loop, it's a woman who set the new world record in an open marathon for women. And Professor Ross Tucker mentioned this paper titled "Can the Recent Sex-Specific Evolutions in Elite Running Performance and be Attributed to Advanced Footwear Technology?" Now, advanced footwear technology, ATF, or simply super shoes, has without a doubt transformed running performances by incorporating specific features into the shoes, leading to notable improvements in race times for both elite and recreational runners. These super shoes, are built with a stiff, curved plate inside a thick foam midsole that is springy and energy returning, helping runners use less energy with essentially with each step. Just the energy returns increased. An important thing to note is it looks like you need both of these tools together. You need the foam and you need the carbon plate to get the overall kind of improvement. Hence why you've not just got carbon soles only. I think it's this PBA foam. Now, These were first introduced in 2016. Super shoes have since been adopted widely across various running distances, including sprints and middle distance events. Now, since these super shoes hit the scene, really, global running records have been noticeably boosted, especially in road races. Runners wearing these super shoes have set new records for men and women across different distances. Studies show that the top marathon runners, for example, have improved their times by around 0.68% when switching from regular shoes to super shoes. Now, these shoes also made an impact on track events where the super shoe spikes with thinner soles compared to the road racing shoes were introduced in 2020. This helped break long-standing plateaus in sprint performances, though improvements in track events have generally been smaller and more variable than those in the road events. Likely, I suppose, the compounding effect of the shoe over time, potentially the durability of the athlete, and how that feeds into the overall record time. Now, the female advantage. Though there has been much discussion about improved running times with advanced footwear, or these super shoes, one key trend has often been overlooked, and that's the super shoes benefits to women's running performance more than men's across all distances. Now, in this study, if you look it up yourself, you will see a graph which is titled Figure 1, and it essentially shows the improvements at 1500 meter, mile, 5000 meter, 5K, 10K, half marathon, full marathon, and there's also 10K road and 10K track, and you can just see everywhere that women are outweighing men in the overall improvements. And at the mile and the 1500 meter, there's only a female improvement here that is registered on this graph. Now, studies show that elite female runners have seen improvements ranging from 1.7 to 2.3% in events like the 10K, half marathon, and marathon, compared to 0.6 to 1.5% improvement for men. Now, for elite marathon runners, the super shoes appear to provide double the advantage for women, resulting in an average time drop of about 3.7 minutes for women and versus the 1.2 minutes for men. This trend isn't limited to road running. In track events, women's performance has also improved more than men's, with female sprinters seeing up to a 1.52% improvement. And this disparity has even narrowed the historical long distance races. Now, traditionally, men's times were about 12% faster, but this difference has now shrunk to around 9% or less in events like the 10K, half marathon, and marathon. That's really what some of the big question marks, is it? Can you say, with these performances, like the Chepngetich performance, is the fact that not only is it a huge step forward in women's times, but it's the fact that it's really encroaching on the gap between the sex differences. Obviously, still, they're not running the same marathon times as men, but one of the things that is proposed here is essentially, can that be attributed to the fact that these super shoes have arrived, and not the fact that, there will always be these like the doping allegation. There's also questions around whether it's the length at which the sport has been professional. Imagine just looking at it as simply as, if you looked at rugby, for example, look at rugby, men's rugby, pre and post professional era. You see this massive inflection in skill, body composition, the forces in contact area, the clear outs, everything, just exponential growth as it went professional. And then you look at women's rugby and you look at the discrepancies between nations, where it was a fully professional team versus a non-professional team. Now, you can't say that's isolated to a given sport. Any sport's going to be like that. And that's an argument for women's running, is that how a lot of these nations, how long has being a professional runner being a valid or potential career path for a woman, which means that potentially we're seeing a drop in the performance gap as a result, not of any exogenous substances or like drugs, essentially. It could just be simply that women now are beginning to develop simply because it's professionalized. But there's also this super shoe question. Now, why this advantage? Now, the noticeable performance boosts linked to advanced footwear technology appear to benefit women more than men, as we've said. Though it's not yet fully understood why. The super shoe help runners. We need to look at two main features. Now, increased shoe stiffness and new midsole materials, so essentially this carbon plate, adding stiffness and this potential energy return. Now, obviously the stiffness here reduces the energy loss at key foot joints, while the springy midsole helps runners conserve more energy with each step. And also, you're just looking at the wear and tear on the limbs potentially here. And there's also discussion as to whether the protection of the athlete during training, whether that could be increasing training volume and allowing for more quality work, which is always a factor to be considered with any kind of running, is that it's not like cycling where there's no impact and you can just train until essentially your cardiovascular system falls over or just your immune system crashes. You've actually got physical limitations in a muscular and skeletal fashion that are preventing the athlete from, say, training 40 hours a week as a runner. Now, the super shoe work in sprinting and shorter track events is less clear, and it may involve different factors like changes in how force is applied and even a slight increase in effective leg length, which we'll come on to. Now, even with promising evidence, research in general still lack the full understanding of how these super shoes boost performance for all runners, especially given that individual responses vary pretty widely. And that's where, obviously, when the Vaporfly, I believe it is, came out initially, and that was just Nike had they were the market leaders, right? Now, obviously, athletes who then weren't sponsored by Nike had a problem. That what do they do now? Someone may have a 2% advantage on them because of the shoe they're wearing. Now, there's still the issue of potentially individual responses to different types of shoes. And if you're an athlete sponsored by a outlet rather than an individual shoe manufacturer, say like Pro Direct versus Adidas or Nike, you can pick which shoe you run. But in most cases, the big flight athletes are sponsored by a given shoe manufacturer, which means if they produce multiple super shoes, then yeah, you could try two of them. Otherwise, hope that the difference between super shoes is smaller, or try them all out and try get sponsored by the one that you're fastest. But the problem is, because it changes year on year, really, as things get developed, the chances of you ending up on the fastest shoe for you aren't that high. But now it is generally thought that they're all much closer to one another, and it's more the individual variation and response to each shoe that is the determining factor of this performance difference. Now, it just makes it incredibly complicated to study them and so on and so forth. But there's also a level of how this has gone under the radar a bit, is the underrepresentation of women in scientific research. A 2022 analysis highlighted a major gap in the super shoe research, where women were largely underrepresented. One study excluded women altogether because they made up such a small portion of total sample. Another analysis focused on super shoe benefits on runner performance and could only find one study involving female participants across research. On general footwear features, only around 13% of participants were women, now showing in a consistent pattern of how low female representation is. Now, To explore this imbalance further, researchers reviewed studies on super shoes published in 2018. They found that out of 51 studies, just 14.5% of the participants were women. Now, 34 studies included only men, while just 2 studies focused solely on women. Now, these female representation is much lower than the already low 34 to 39% rate across all sports science research. Now, this gender imbalance could stem from several factors. Now, prototype carbon shoes are often not made in a full range of sizes. It's understandable. You make a prototype car, you're just going to stick to, a very limited run of models, essentially, or anything prototype. You just want to be able to, you don't want to test every single size until you've got close to what you think the end product's going to look like. Now, funding or study requirements can also encourage researchers to use homogeneous groups, which sometimes leads to studies focusing more on male participants. Now, researchers have also chosen to only male data, even when other race data is frequently available for both sexes. While some researchers may view this as male-only approach as a way of control for gender differences, the narrow focus restricts progress by missing insights into super shoes and might benefit women differently. Now, ultimately, the lack of focused research on super shoes limits understanding and innovation in footwear. But the other thing we have to bear in mind is often you got to think the person doing these studies, they don't want that. There's a lot of work that goes into doing the study, and women being due to their menstrual cycle and the fact that their hormonal levels are changing, often in general and scientific research, unless the product is specifically for women, they are usually excluded for that fact alone. You want as few confounding factors as you can. You don't want the fact that the woman's hormonal cycle and their hormonal state to result in a change. In, say, you're doing a study on maximal strength and you did it over a 6-week period, where you took their baseline and where you take the final results could be different purely based on not the exercise modality, but the hormonal state. And if it is because of the exercise modality that they've improved, you don't know the magnitude, because you don't know if hormonal state has meant that actually their baseline would have been lower now than it was later. And you don't know if it's enhanced it, reduced the effect, and you just don't know what's going on. So that tends to be why it is happening. When it comes to the super shoe information, I suppose that's less of an argument, because in theory, you make the shoe, you take a bunch of people on a given day, and you do the test that same day. You put them in shoe X, which is traditional shoe, and you put them in shoe Y, and you see the difference. But like the paper argues, potentially the shoes are being made in larger sizes that don't fit women, and therefore they're not getting the data. Arguably, if you're making a 9, 10, 11, 12, or 8, 9, 10, 11, you could do 10 and 11 and 6 and 5, for example. You could split it out and get your sample sizes, but clearly, necessarily that's not what's happening here. So, why do women benefit more from carbon super shoes than men? Now, the impact of this advanced footwear, or these super shoes, on running performance has been studied primarily in men, and findings so far indicate no clear, consistent performance advantages for women over men when both use, advance these super shoes. Now, a few studies on running economy found similar improvements in efficiency for both sexes, with one study reporting benefits between 1.7 to 7.2%, which is, there you go, there's that natural variation. That is what we're talking about, these huge gaps on individual to individual improvements. Now, this is for highly trained runners of both genders, and another showing that trained female runners experience energy and economy gains comparable to those observed in men. Now, these studies are few and they don't yet account for key physiological and biomechanical differences between women and men that might influence how the super shoes affect each group. Women and men differ in factors such as injury susceptibility, biomechanics, energy use, and fatigue patterns during running, which may contribute again to super shoe providing unique benefits for women that are not yet fully understood. Now, these are some areas where these differences could be significant. So, body mass. Women generally have lower average body mass than men, around 22.5% in elite track and field runners. Now, since carbon shoes rely on energy storing materials and features like increased shoe stiffness, lower body mass might influence how efficiently the shoe returns energy, although evidence about the role of body mass in running economy is mixed. Could be important, especially in sprints where acceleration matters more. For instance, light body mass might allow super shoe energy to return features to have a different effect on women's movement mechanics. You've also got shoe size and fit. Shoe prototypes used in these studies are often designed for larger sizes, which could limit female representation in research. As we've said already, women have generally a smaller shoe size, and but what we need to consider here is this affects more than just access. Shoe geometry changes with size, meaning that women generally use smaller shoe sizes which have relatively thicker midsoles or more pronounced rocker shapes. These differences could shift the shoe's performance impact by altering how forces are applied through each step, possibly affecting energy return, ankle mechanics, and horizontal push off, which are critical for maximizing running efficiency. Now, leg length and effective stride. This is also an interesting one. Women generally have shorter features. Are shorter in stature. They're just shorter human beings. Means that the same added midsole thickness on a super shoe can lead to a relatively greater increase in their effective leg length. You think if you add 20 mil onto 100 mil, it's a 20% bump, whereas if you add 20 mil onto 200 mil, it's a 10% bump. So you see where we're going here. Now, this change could lead to increase in stride length and more efficient gait, as suggested by some earlier research showing longer strides in women when using these super shoes at lower speeds. Now, essentially, the same shoe could produce proportionally greater stride benefits for women due to their shorter average leg length, as I've said. Now, we've also got stride efficiency. Women tend to have higher stride frequency than men over any given distance, meaning that they make more ground contacts to cover the same distance. This higher contact rate could give women more frequent opportunities to benefit from these super shoes' energy return features, amplifying the shoe's effect over the course of an entire run. Now, this compounding effect might explain why super shoes appear to deliver a greater cumulative benefit for women, particularly in long distance events. You think you're just increasing the utilization of the shoe over a given distance and therefore resulting in a greater overall benefit. Now, muscle tendon unit properties. Super shoes impact on the foot and calf muscles, specifically the gastrocnemius medialis, which appears to vary between men and women due to differences in tendon elasticity and muscle activation patterns. Just your calf, basically, and how it's utilized during the run. Now, super shoes can change how these muscles and tendons contribute to forward propulsion, which may benefit women's unique muscle tendon characteristics differently, but possibly enhancing their endurance and propulsion efficiency. Now, given these sex-based differences, future research, and this is the key thing they kind of highlight, is that future research needs to use equal representation and analyze results by gender to identify if super shoes offer unique benefits for women. And these scaling, this means scaling the design elements of a super shoe, such as midsole thickness and stiffness, to align which characteristics like body mass, leg length, and shoe size, having the kind of biggest impact here. Now, additionally, since much of the early research predicting runners' gains from super shoes was conducted with male-only participants, it remains pretty unclear if these lab-based findings fully translate to race day, both men and women. Now, it represents two things. One, it's an opportunity for the manufacturer to, suppose, target women and potentially offer, potentially offering two different actual designs to some extent. Now, my opinion on that is that if you're first to market, this could be beneficial, because obviously if you say you've got 20% market share and you're selling, like, let's just say 1 million shoes, right? You're selling 1 million shoes and they're unisex. So you're selling those shoes. If 10 other suppliers start selling women and men's, and you then start selling women and men's, and you stay with the 1 million market share, then it's just an increased overhead. You're having to produce double the products to maintain your customer base. Whereas if you're first to market to show that women, men, different in how they interact with these super shoes, and therefore require slightly different technology and slightly different, maybe not different technology, but just where the plate is thickest, widest, where the foam is placed and how it's placed to gain the max benefit. You prove that this is the case, doing an A/B test, like men's shoe versus women's shoe on a woman, women's shoe versus men's shoe on a man. And you're first to market, then you could increase your market share because people go, oh, well, I'm a woman or I'm a man. And or specifically a woman who's now looking at the market and they go, well, do I want this shoe only designed really for men, or do I want this one for women? And therefore you increase your market share. But then also from a more faith in sport point of view, you want this research to be carried out so that you have more faith in the sport. Like if you discover that the gap that was once 10% between men and women, or 20% between men and women, was this in a normal shoe, and then you take them and you put them in these super shoes, and that has reduced to say 15%, then at least now when you watch these performances and you see these women encroaching ever so close and closer to men's times, you can go, well, the shoes have benefited them greater proportionally than they have men. And it builds your confidence in the sport that something is a malpractice or is happening. Someone's cheating, essentially. Now, obviously, this brings us on to the PED question and the crazy performances like that from Chepngetich. Now, PED, just performance-enhancing drugs, testosterone and so on and so forth. Steroids, essentially, and other substances external to the body that are injected into the body or already taken into the body. That's what, when you hear exogenous substances, it's just anything like that. Could be paracetamol, exogenous substance, not naturally there, you're injecting it, happy days. Now, if future research doesn't find that super shoes directly benefit women more than men in running, other factors might be driving recent improvements in women's performance compared to men's. And these are the sort of possible examples. We've gone over this a little bit as we've gone through, but we'll go into greater detail now. Race tactics and drafting. Women may benefit more from newer race strategies like cooperative drafting, especially in long-distance road races. While men usually have pacers for only part of the race, women can be paced throughout, giving them a consistent advantage in energy conservation, essentially. Essentially, what's happening here is you can have a male pacer. Now, because of the male-female divide, the male pacer who will get spat out the back halfway through a marathon at the punchy end of things is able to comfortably, not a fair word, but for them, comfortably still pace them all the way, because to them a 2:10 might actually be very comfortable. Like, yeah, they need to train, and yeah, they are going to probably do some kind of taper for this, but it's not where they're at their bleeding edge. And anyone who's an athlete knows what it's like to, take 10% off their effort and how differently that now feels. And obviously that presents an advantage, because pacing has this kind of, it's like whenever you've done an event, whether that's running, whether that's a team sport, whether that's whether that's running and cycling, you know how much deeper you can go just from the almost moral support that people suffering around you give you. And that person being with you all the way to the end means that in your head, you think when you go off the front and you're on your own, you're the manager of your own destiny. You've got to keep on top of it. And all it takes is a momentary lapse in concentration to drop off the pace. Whereas if you've got the pacer, you just, in your head, all you're going is, there's 5K left. Just stick on the back of them. Just stay there. Just every time that you think you haven't got it in you, you just keep on stating the same thing to yourself, that you're just going to stay on them. It's like if you had someone pacing you in a TT, you just stay on the wheel. If you're a cyclist, time trial. Stay on the wheel, stay on the wheel, stay on the wheel. Don't let the wheel go. And it makes life easier. Now, training and nutrition advances. Recent evidence in training and nutrition has focused more on female-specific needs, which may be boosting women's performance improvements more than men's. You've got all the stuff now around focusing more on the menstrual cycle and how best to optimize women's training around this and reduce the impact it has negatively on their training. You've got the historical access and opportunities. Women may be reaching their peak athletic potential later than men due to historical inequalities in sport funding and opportunities. Even though women's access to sport has improved since 1980s, their performance is largely plateaued until superhoes was introduced. This slower development may mean women have more room to improve as newer technologies and opportunities become available. And potentially, maybe it's like a chicken and egg scenario, or of the women almost need the technology to come to show this potential, for then more investment to come, for then more technology to come, for them to show even more potential, for more investment to come, to then step their way up. Now you've got PEDs, performance enhancing drugs. These have influenced running performances across genders, but women's records in particular have been historically affected. For instance, the majority of track and field records set before random drug testing started are in women's events, hinting at the stronger historical reliance on doping for women. Additionally, evidence suggests that women might benefit more than men from PEDs, like androgens, which were used heavily in the past, doping agents, just hormones essentially. Now, why would it be that women would benefit more from this than men? Well, to understand this, part of what makes, say, TRT so beneficial for like gaining muscle, for example, or any kind of testosterone therapy or just using testosterone, is the fact that, let's just use random numbers here. Say your free testosterone is 500, right? That that from a snapshot in time, from a blood test. The likelihood is it goes up and down. So maybe the mean value is 500, but the peak is say 700 and the trough is say 300. Whereas from these external substances that you're taking, you can just make it so that it's nice and flat. So you're always getting this big gain, or upping it to 800 perpetually and it's really flat. So then you think women and their hormonal fluctuations, they could be benefiting from it more. One, because say for testosterone, their overall numbers lower. So by doing a similar dose, the actual relative increase is larger, but also the relative flattening of that cycle is greater, and therefore potentially receive greater benefits. They haven't benefited from puberty in the same way as a male has. So no, it's not going to change bone structure, for example, but that potential peak muscle mass potential, and in this case of running, we're talking like lung capacity and just the cardiovascular system. Yes, it's not going to actually physically change those in a almost like a volumetric way. Yes, the left side of the heart, the main pumping side of the heart, can increase with training. But we're not talking to an extent that puberty affects. But by having this extra testosterone, it means that the gains that can be made faster and compounded quicker, essentially. Now, lastly, during recent years, anti-doping efforts have been less effective, with fewer tests conducted for female athletes and lower worldwide testing rates during the pandemic, which I think really, when we look at things like cycling, could be why we've seen such a recent elevation in cycling performances. Now, this could mean that the super shoes' apparent benefits might be partially influenced by unobserved doping, but this connection remains speculative, and it does in cycling as well. There's just this thought that in general, especially these people in a bit more far out, like non-European communities, where the testing may not happen as frequently or rigorously thanks to geography, that over the course of COVID and the lessening of overall testing, that could be playing a large factor. So, what's your takeaway from all this? Are you someone who's never used carbon super shoes and now wants them because they've heard of the benefits? Were you ever aware of the potential benefits that women could be making versus men and this disparity? And what do you think? Do you think it's all above board? Do you think that super shoes are just playing this big role in improving women's performance? Or do you think that something shady is going on? Do you think somehow that they've managed to incorporate greater doping, or doping in general, and just women are showing the effects of it more? Do you think it's a historic thing? Well, let me know. Feel free to share your opinions with me on Instagram, email, or on the VO2 Lounge Discord server, or the WhatsApp community. We now have a WhatsApp community where you can join and chat with like-minded people and myself, share opinions on all these topics that we discuss here at the VO2 Lounge. For more content like this, explore my previous works, follow the show, or leave a 5-star review if you like what you've heard. And lastly, I would like to challenge you to share the pod with one friend today. It really helps the pod grow. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, it's goodbye.